Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive into the life of one of the most complex and brilliant figures of the 20th century, Robert Oppenheimer. In this first part, let's go back to the very beginning, his birth, his upbringing, and the roots of his genius. Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born on April 22, 1904, in New York City. He was the son of Julius Oppenheimer, a wealthy textile importer who had emigrated from Germany, and Ella Friedman, a painter. His family was part of the affluent, cultured, secular Jewish elite of Manhattan's Upper West Side. From an early age, Oppenheimer showed signs of brilliance. He was a sickly child, often isolated, and spent most of his time reading and studying. By the time he was 10, he was already reading classics in literature and philosophy. He loved mineralogy, and once gave a lecture at the New York Mineralogical Club when he was only 12 years old. He studied at the Ethical Culture Fieldston School, a progressive institution that emphasized ethical development and academic excellence. The school's focus on moral responsibility and critical thinking would have a deep influence on Oppenheimer's later life. Even as a child, he was quiet, intense, and deeply introspective. His teachers noted that he had a restless brilliance, always curious, always questioning, but also somewhat socially awkward and emotionally distant. This was the foundation of the man who would later be called the father of the atomic bomb. After finishing high school, Oppenheimer enrolled at Harvard University in 1922 at the age of 18. Despite entering a bit later than some of his peers due to illness, he made up for lost time and fast. He completed 4 years of coursework in just 3 years, graduating in 1925 with a degree in chemistry, though his true passion had shifted to theoretical physics. At Harvard, he studied a wide range of subjects, from Greek philosophy and French literature to physics and mathematics. He was known as intense, driven, and incredibly smart, but also somewhat moody and distant. He wasn't just book smart, he was a polymath. After Harvard, Oppenheimer went to Cambridge University in England to work under J. Thomson, the discoverer of the electron. But things didn't go well. Oppenheimer struggled with experimental work and was deeply unhappy. At one point, he had a mental breakdown and even attempted to poison his tutor, a story that's often cited but never fully confirmed. Realizing that lab work wasn't his strength, he turned to theoretical physics. In 1926, he transferred to Göttingen University in Germany, which was a global hub for quantum mechanics at the time. There, he studied under Max Born and interacted with legends like Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, and Wolfgang Pauli. He received his PhD in 1927 at the age of 23, publishing multiple papers on quantum theory, including one that introduced what we now call the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, a foundational concept in molecular quantum mechanics. By his mid-20s, Oppenheimer was already a rising star in physics. He wasn't just a brilliant thinker, he was helping shape the future of science. After completing his PhD in Germany, Oppenheimer returned to the United States in 1927 and quickly became a central figure in the American physics community. He held dual appointments at both Caltech, California Institute of Technology, and the University of California, Berkeley, an unusual and prestigious arrangement that reflected just how highly regarded he was, even at a young age. At Berkeley, he quickly built a reputation not only as a brilliant physicist, but as an inspiring teacher and mentor. His lectures were intense and poetic. He often quoted Sanskrit, recited poetry, and connected science to philosophy and literature. Students admired his depth, but also noted his mood swings and emotional intensity. He had this magnetic personality, but could also be distant, enigmatic, even intimidating. This was a time when quantum mechanics was still very new, and Oppenheimer helped introduce it to a generation of American physicists. He trained dozens of graduate students, many of whom would later go on to become leaders in the field themselves. By the 1930s, he was seen not just as a brilliant scientist, but as a thought leader in the scientific community. He was deeply engaged in theoretical work on quantum field theory, neutron stars, and even black holes, well ahead of his time. But it wasn't just science that filled his mind. During this period, Oppenheimer also became increasingly political. He was passionate about social justice, horrified by the rise of fascism in Europe, and began associating with leftist causes, something that would later come back to haunt him. By the early 1940s, World War II was in full swing, and fears were growing that Nazi Germany might develop an atomic bomb. In response, the U.S. launched a top-secret effort to beat them to it, the Manhattan Project, and guess who they chose to lead the scientific side of it? That's right, Robert Oppenheimer. This was a surprising choice to many. Oppenheimer had never won a Nobel Prize, wasn't the most senior physicist, and had a history of leftist political associations. But he had a unique mix of brilliance, charisma, and vision. He could think big, connect ideas, and lead people, and that's exactly what the project needed. In 1942, Oppenheimer was appointed as scientific director of the Manhattan Project. He oversaw the building of an entire secret city, Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. This isolated town became the heart of atomic bomb development, a place where hundreds of the world's best scientists, engineers, and military personnel worked around the clock on a single goal: to split the atom and unleash its power. Oppenheimer threw himself into the work completely. He managed not just the science, but also the egos, the conflicts, the timelines. He was everywhere, in the labs, in meetings, walking the dusty roads of Los Alamos in his signature pork pie hat. Under his leadership, 2 types of atomic bombs were developed: Little Boy, a uranium bomb, and Fat Man, a plutonium bomb. On July 16, 1945, the first successful test of an atomic bomb, known as the Trinity test, took place in the New Mexico desert. When the explosion lit up the sky, Oppenheimer famously recalled a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb had worked, and the world would never be the same again. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima. Just 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The devastation was beyond anything the world had ever seen. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. Entire cities were flattened. Radiation sickness claimed even more lives in the days, months, and years that followed. Though the bombs forced Japan to surrender and brought an end to World War II, the moral weight of what had been done hit Oppenheimer hard almost immediately. When Oppenheimer met with President Harry Truman shortly after the bombings, he famously said, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman was reportedly furious. He told his aides, "I don't want to see that crybaby scientist ever again." Oppenheimer had spent years leading the scientific effort, pushing forward with urgency. But now that the mission was complete, he struggled with what it had unleashed. He began to see himself not as a hero, but as someone who had opened a door that maybe shouldn't have been opened. Back at Los Alamos, he gave a speech to the lab staff, saying, in some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, "The physicists have known sin." It was a stunning moment, the father of the atomic bomb, publicly acknowledging guilt and moral conflict. Over the months that followed, Oppenheimer became a vocal advocate against the further use and development of nuclear weapons. He didn't want the US to build the hydrogen bomb, which was far more destructive than the atomic bomb. He believed that the arms race would be catastrophic for humanity, but by opposing the H-bomb and speaking out, he was making powerful enemies. By the early 1950s, the Cold War was heating up. The US was locked in a growing arms race with the Soviet Union. Fear of communism was everywhere, and anyone with a hint of past ties to the Communist Party was suddenly under suspicion, even someone like J. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who had helped win the war. Oppenheimer had, in the 1930s, briefly associated with leftist political groups. His wife Kitty and his brother Frank had both been members of the Communist Party, although Oppenheimer himself was never officially a party member. His past came back to haunt him. In 1954, Oppenheimer was called before a security hearing by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, EC. It wasn't a trial, but it felt like one. The government questioned his loyalty, his past associations, and even his character. The hearing lasted for 4 weeks, and it was brutal. Oppenheimer was humiliated in public. Many of his colleagues defended him, but it didn't matter. The outcome had already been decided behind closed doors. The verdict? Oppenheimer's security clearance was revoked. This meant he could no longer work with classified information or advise the government on nuclear policy. In other words, they kicked him out of the room. For Oppenheimer, it was a crushing blow. He had gone from national hero to national outcast, and all because he dared to speak out against the hydrogen bomb, an advocate for arms control. The AEC justified their decision by calling him a security risk, but many historians agree this was political revenge, plain and simple. After losing his security clearance in 1954, Oppenheimer didn't fight back publicly. He was deeply hurt not just by the decision, but by the betrayal of colleagues and a government he had once served with devotion. He retreated from the political world and returned to his academic roots. He spent his remaining years as the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, a quiet place where some of the greatest minds in science and philosophy gathered. There, he focused on writing, teaching, and thinking. But the pain never truly went away. In private, he often reflected on the atomic bomb and what it had done to the world. And to him, but time has a strange way of shifting perspectives. In 1963, nearly a decade after his fall from grace, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award, one of the highest honors in science. It was a symbolic gesture, an unofficial apology from the U.S. government. Oppenheimer accepted it quietly, with dignity, saying, "In the eyes of the world, this award is a symbol that we are not afraid of controversy." But by then, his health was already declining. He had developed throat cancer, likely from his long years of heavy smoking. His voice, once powerful and persuasive, began to fade. On February 18, 1967, J. Robert Oppenheimer died in Princeton. He was 62 years old. His death marked the end of a chapter, not just in science, but in history itself. He had changed the world, and the world had changed him. J. Robert Oppenheimer wasn't just a physicist. He was a symbol of brilliance, of moral conflict, of the burden of knowledge. He gave humanity a weapon it was never meant to have, and he spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that meant. In many ways, Oppenheimer was a tragic figure, not because he failed, but because he succeeded. He once quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, saying, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It wasn't a line of pride, it was a whisper of horror. Today, his legacy is still debated. Was he a hero? A villain? Or just a man who was forced to make an impossible choice? What's undeniable is this: Oppenheimer changed the course of history, not with hate, but with equations, not with armies, but with atoms, and in doing so, he taught the world a painful lesson, that knowledge, once unleashed, cannot be undone. So the next time you hear the name Oppenheimer, don't just think of the bomb, think of the man, the thinker, the broken genius who tried to hold the weight of the world and cracked under it.